Hey guys, it's Hannah. In this episode, Nate and I continue the conversation we started in episode 2. So if you haven't listened to it yet, I encourage you to go back and check that out. And in this episode, episode 3, Nate and I explore our value as educators, inspiring intrinsic motivation, training's need for evolution, and changing the mindset around the stigma as education leads to social progress. And as educators, we are truly on the front lines as we help others navigate change. Yes, we are making the content accessible to the student, but the student has to be willing to put in the effort, the perseverance over time to keep at it. And part of a leader's role and part of a trainer's role is to keep that employee engaged enough to recognize they own their own learning. Some of it is the intrinsic motivation to help the trainee feel like they are owning their learning in some aspect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. Without that, we're just talking heads, right?
Yes.
And without that as a leader, you're just micromanaging. I remember this guy I worked with for a while. He would tell me this all the time. He said that when he was playing football in high school, the coach would just yell at the boys, "Can't teach want to, boys. I can't teach want to." There's this need for the students in your class, whether it's kindergarten or seniors or college level, to see some sort of investment that they have in why they're learning things, or else they don't learn. They drop out or they mentally drop out. And Hannah, I have not actually taught in a public school. I've experienced it as a student though, but I'm sure you've seen that in classrooms or have at least experienced it secondhand as a student of yourself.
I have. And this makes me actually think of a great book by Liz Wiseman called Multipliers. It's for the audience of leaders, but a multiplier is someone who multiplies their knowledge and multiplies their value to those on their team. And to me, those in my classroom. And I can remember back to when I was teaching 4th grade, I would notice those students. Some of them wanted and would volunteer to do more and wanted to be involved. And some of them, like you said, it was part of my way of building some intrinsic motivation to engage them further. And so I remember in particular, at that time, I didn't have a clicker. So someone in the back would actually, one of my students would roll through my PowerPoint slides for me. And I called these students my right-hand man or my right-hand woman. And there was just that intrinsic motivation. Hey, I'm important because I'm helping further the lesson. I'm helping further the learning experience. I would actually have volunteer students help me at the beginning of the year set up my classroom from the year past because they wanted to be able to try their hand at something that I did. And I'd even involve some of my students, again, depending on the personality, depending on their motivation, in my lesson planning. Some of the greatest learning experiences that I did with my 4th graders were not thought up by their teacher. It was thought up by the students themselves. I remember I had a student in Colorado. We were reading about measuring how far away our classroom was from the office. And we were out in a trailer at that time. And she raised her hand and she said, we're reading about this class doing this exercise. Could we actually do it? And that was one of the most impressionable experiences where I had my 4th graders measuring out how many feet and how many yards our trailer was from the front desk. And it was a very meaningful activity that was student-led and it was thought up by the students themselves. And in that way, I feel like I was multiplying what I could do by allowing my students to see themselves as part of the education process, that they too were teachers teaching the class with their ideas and inspiring in that way.
I can picture a bunch of 4th graders with a ruler and somebody putting their finger down, moving the ruler out because they're all involved. It's so hands-on and they're seeing measurement in a completely different way than just, again, reading about another class doing this thing and going, oh yeah, that was cool. Why not? Why not? And that gets back to the heart of what we were talking about earlier. So we've talked about the current state of education being somewhat of a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, which when we were an industrialized country and we had most of the industry here, it makes sense. You need to have a learning process that matches that. But I am going to say that Henry Ford, who's probably the main name you think about when you think about the Industrial Revolution, Model T Ford and all that, he could recognize the limitations of his own process. In fact, his most famous quote is, "The Model T Ford comes in any color the customer wants as long as it's black." And it exposes the problem that there's no flexibility and accommodation of everybody. You gain efficiency, you gain speed, you gain affordability, but you lose the ability to then get out of the classroom, put the measuring stick on the ground, and actually have people move the ruler, because the curriculum says that we actually just read about this. And if we do this activity, which is probably going to take 45 minutes to an hour, well, the reading was only supposed to be 15 minutes, and now we've completely ruined the lesson plans for the rest of the year. And the assembly line, the Industrial Revolution says, now you follow the lesson plan, you stick to it, and you make widgets.
That's right. That's right. And we can see why society and our world, our work world, is changing. And we hear so much about growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. And I want to pose this question and kind of tackle it. What is the importance of education and learning? And what I'm hearing you say is, let's break down some of these barriers to think outside of the box. And when we're thinking outside of the box of what truly is education and learning, it's about changing mindset. It's about changing perspective for people to better tap into their potential. And a lot of what we do as trainers is look towards that growth mindset and pull those people in, because mindset is everything.
Yeah. And I think the world is moving that way too. If you look back 100 years, the technology wasn't necessarily in place to have the robot do the assembly line. It needed human beings to do that. But now we're looking at a lot of those jobs are being automated by robots. And
yes.
And we don't need people that have their hands on the wheel anymore. We need to have critical thinkers, to your point, that can anticipate challenges, that can problem solve, that can think their way through setbacks, that can understand that failure isn't permanent, to quote Winston Churchill, that can even out-ideate the competition. So even if you want to think about it in a very business setting where we're trying to produce X widgets more than X company, we need to have people that are able to think around those corners more than the competition. And so education becomes not just a tool to make sure that I can do my job, but it becomes a part of what I do to become a human being that's reaching my fullest potential.
I love that you said that. It's no longer about how much you know, and it's now more about how much you're willing to grow.
Oh,
and
that's a quote.
That just came to me. That just wasn't in the
notes. Put that on the pressure. Let's make a t-shirt.
Yeah, because growth mindset really embraces the idea that everything is figure outable. So whether you know how to do it or not, we live in a world today where everything is figure outable. It's about connecting those dots so that we can keep putting one foot in front of the other, finding that resource, connecting with that content, or connecting with that community. It's more now about our willingness to keep learning, to keep growing. And I'm going to mention the word perseverance here, because a lot of growth mindset is the grit to overcome obstacles. And as trainers, when we're in the trenches with our students, with our trainees, we're modeling for them that perseverance to overcome those obstacles.
Yeah, I agree. And part of that grit is being able to go back to the table over and over again to stakeholders, to administrators, to the community around us. Because believe me, I've been on the social media platform and you see the 4 or 5 people that always want to voice that we should cut all the funding for schools. And like, even they don't actually think we should cut it public education. They just don't want to pay taxes. I get it. Nobody does. But I'm just going to quote John Dewey here. He's one of my favorite philosophers. He was actually a contemporary of Henry Ford. So he was around the same time period. So we probably should have listened to him a little bit more. And he said, education is social progress.
Yes.
Education is growth. Education is not preparation for life, or I'll say for a job. Education is life itself. Oh, I love that, right? Like the process
Absolutely.
of learning and growing is what it means to be human. And to be a
Yes.
part of facilitating that is one of the greatest honors in the world.
Well, taking that and thinking about our world, it's constantly changing. And our work world, I mean, whether you're in corporate, whether you're in public education or higher education, there are changes coming at you so fast now, faster than ever before. And constant change requires continual learning to stay up to date in the role, to stay up to date in the company, in the industry. And as we're thinking about how do we communicate this value of training, especially in the corporate world, we really need to think about change management. And change management has become a buzzword in the corporate world. But when we pull back the layers of how to manage change, it really comes down to how we set people up and walk with our people through change, which is the role of a trainer, a teacher, an educator, a mentor, a coach.
Yeah, I agree. I think about my own experience with change. And I feel like it also models the grief model a little bit. And I'm sure that you've had experiences with that when you've had some changes and you go through this process where sometimes I skip right to acceptance, but it can't actually stick there, right? You go right to acceptance because that's my growth. I have to be a growth mindset. So I'm going to accept this change. And then all of a sudden you go back to grief or anger or bargaining. But if we use both the change management model and the grief model and really see that training and learning and change management and through a cycle of grief, they're very similar and they're very universal to the human experience.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought that up. I recently was watching a TED talk about this very thing, about how it's not really that people are resistant to change. They're resistant to loss. And it's not the change that we resist itself. It's what we stand to lose if the change actually happens. So as leaders and as trainers, we need to spend more time and attention acknowledging what's being lost in this and thinking about those core types of loss, whether it's safety. Will this change jeopardize my sense of safety? Whether it's freedom. Will this change endanger the autonomy I value? Status is another one. Will this change cost me my sense of status? I think the last two were belonging and fairness. Will this change strain my relationships? Will this change challenge my sense of fairness? So as trainers, when we consider those changes that we are walking through with our people, how open to change are they? And how can we present these ideas in such a way that we can assure people of what will stay the same and what is being lost, and acknowledge that loss as we're then moving forward into what that change looks like?
I'm glad you said that because I think the heart of this is that we don't expect people to stay in one place. And that's the place we can find agreement when we're trying to communicate our why as educators. We all want to get from a place where someone's new or someone doesn't know information or can't do a skill or a job. And we want to get them to the place where they're able to do something different, to open their mind, to think around corners, wherever it is. There's a growth edge there. And so when we can communicate that and get on that same page and really say that we're partnering together to help people grow organizationally, personally, professionally, societally, even, that's the place where we're able to find that common ground. Because if we really are just looking at it as time spent before someone can get into a role or time spent before they can start their career for looking at public education, it becomes how can we minimize the costs as much as possible. But if it's how can we be the best we can possibly be and grow more than our competition and be the most educated country in the world, suddenly it changes and you take on what John F. Kennedy said, where our progress as a nation or as a company or as a person can be no swifter than our progress in education, because that human mind is the fundamental resource that we have. That to me is where we communicate that why. And when we can find that common ground, we can find that place where we're really working towards that same objective. It's not that difficult to communicate the value of what we bring to the table.
I cannot agree with you more. So, in thinking about a call to action for us as educators and how we can communicate this value to our peers, to those in leadership about what we're doing, I think tapping into the integration of how we are change agents. We're on the front lines. And you hear so much about change agility and being willing to adapt. And if we see ourselves as those change agents on the front lines, how are we then bringing those people with us in the changes that the organization is making or the technology is making or what have you with the content that we are teaching?
Yeah, I love that. Maybe for a homework assignment for anyone that's listening to this, you could look for the organizational or administrative goals that you're working with, right? So if you're a public school teacher, what are the real goals that your superintendent and that the school district has, and maybe even the department lead or whoever it is? And if you're working in a business sector, what are the actual business objectives? What are the strategic priorities for the year? And really just start to think about that and say, well, then how do I partner? How do I reach across that invisible line and say, I know that you want these things. I want them too. And here's how I think we can get there together.